Welcome to the Reischauer Center for East Asian Studies here at SAIS Johns Hopkins University. Today, we have another in our series of special Reischauer Center seminars for the spring term. Our speaker today, Dr. Toshi Yoshihara, is one of the most distinguished specialists here in Washington and across the country on Asian security issues. And we're delighted, Toshi, to have you with us. Currently, Dr. Yoshihara serves as Senior Fellow with the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments here in Washington. He has served previously as the John A. Van Buren Chair for Asia Pacific Studies and also as a professor of strategy at the U.S. Naval War College. He has taught at many distinguished universities, at the Fletcher School for Diplomacy at Tufts, at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at UCSD, University of California, San Diego, the Strategy Department of the U.S. Air War College, and also at the School of Foreign Service of Georgetown University. Today he will be discussing his latest work. You may know some of his other classic books, such as Red Star Over the Pacific, but today he'll be discussing his most recent report, which is entitled Dragon Against the Sun, Chinese Views of Japanese Sea Power. And Dr. Yoshihara, welcome to the Reischauer Center. It's wonderful to have you with us.
Thank you very much, Professor Calder, for that very kind introduction. It's a real pleasure for me to be here this afternoon to speak to you about my latest report entitled Dragon Against the Sun. Just wanted to say a few words about, before I begin, my personal and professional connection to SAIS. I'm a SAIS graduate, class of 1998. Loved my 2 years at SAIS and took a lot of great Asia Studies courses during my time then. I'm actually currently a course director for an executive education course that has been held in May of every year. It's a SAIS CSBA course on strategy in Asia. We've had Professor Calder attend as a guest speaker. So I've had an opportunity to work with him in that capacity as well. The course is actually run by Professor Tom Mankin, and I'm the course director for the program. And it's a great program because it brings in a lot of young military officers and civilians in the various federal agencies who are either interested in or will be working on Asia issues in their professional capacities. And so it's been a real pleasure to engage with those students. I'm also a regular speaker for the new recently established Strategic Thinkers program run by Professor Dan Marston. Some of you who are attending SAIS have probably attended classes with some of these rising stars in the military who've been hand-selected to attend SAIS to immerse themselves in the study of strategy. And so I get a chance at least twice a year to run seminars with them talking about Chinese strategic culture and so forth. So I have still a lot of professional and personal connections to SAIS. So it's really a great pleasure for me to be back with the Reischauer Center. So thank you again for having me this afternoon. What I would like to do is to briefly summarize my report, Dragon Against the Sun, and talk about the main themes and the main takeaways, and then hopefully we'll have plenty of time to engage in Q&A. So the report that came out through CSBA, the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, was published in May of 2020. And what was so interesting about my experience with the report was that it attracted quite a bit of attention in Japan. The report was subsequently translated in Japan by a local press called Business Sha in September. So pretty extraordinary, frankly, that the report came out in May and then it was rolled out in about 4 months. It was a real honor to have the translator be the former chief of the maritime staff, Admiral Takei, who supervised the translation of the report. And for those of you who may be interested in the Japanese version of the report, it is here and it is available and on Amazon Japan. It's actually done quite well, in fact, over the past year. Whenever, I guess I have the Chinese to thank for. So, whenever there is a maritime incident involving Japan, the book shoots up in its rankings. But in any case, I wanted to actually offer a few words about sort of the backdrop to sort of the evolution of my study on this topic as a basis for talking about the report itself. So to give you a sense of why I wrote the report when I did. So I began to follow the Sino-Japanese military balance and the naval balance specifically more than a decade ago. And I published a series of studies from about 2012 to 2015, basically recommending that Japan should adopt its own version of so-called anti-access area denial capabilities. So anti-access area denial, or A2AD for short, is basically premised on this idea that we are now entering an age of long-range precision firepower, particularly in the form of missiles. And that these types of weapon systems are now making it increasingly dangerous and difficult for traditional power projection forces to operating within the range of those missiles. So things that come to mind, including the aircraft carrier, is of course one asset that is particularly vulnerable to A2AD. So in the Sino-US context, the United States, of course, has forward deployed carrier in the region. And the Chinese have in recent years developed a whole panoply of long-range anti-ship cruise missiles, including most famously the anti-ship ballistic missile to hold these large surface combatants at risk. And so in the Japanese context, I basically argued that if Japan were to develop its own set of A2AD capabilities, that Japan would essentially be able to turn the tables on China. But what was important about my argument then was that I argued then, and as I argue now, that it's important to remember, though, that A2AD capabilities themselves are not a war winner. That at best, a Japanese version of an A2AD strategy might help to deny the Chinese military, the People's Liberation Army, its operational objectives, particularly its initial operational objectives. That it might, should deterrence fail and conflict break out, force a stalemate on China, meaning preventing China from achieving its operational objectives early on and presenting a fait accompli to the international community. So a Japanese A2AD strategy would be able to force a stalemate on China. And what it would do is it would shape conditions for a counteroffensive. In other words, by blocking China, by balking China's initial strategy, it would essentially seek to buy time, especially for the United States, to bring in reinforcements from continental United States and from different theaters of the world, because the United States, as a distant power, has to conquer the proverbial tyranny of geography, or the tyranny of distance, in order to get to the Western Pacific. And so a Japanese A2AD strategy would at least have these kinds of payoffs and dividends, right? To buy time for the alliance to organize itself for a counteroffensive against Chinese aggression. But in my view, as I said, A2AD has its limits, and that therefore allied conventional military power, and the traditional forms of power like power projection, sea control, air superiority forces, to achieve command of the sea or to achieve command of the air, are still critical for the alliance in order for the alliance to compel the enemy's will. And yet, despite this view, I observed with growing alarm that the larger conventional balance had in fact continued to shift unabated since I wrote those earlier studies. And thus I wrote this report, Red Star, Dragon Against the Sun, to draw attention to the shift in this local balance of power between China and Japan, a balance, I might add, that has remained relatively under-examined. And so to put this report in this broader context of my works is that this report should be viewed as really one part of a series of studies that I've written on the Sino-Japanese military balance. So let me now turn to the argument itself. The premise of my argument for this report is that China is displacing Japan as the leading sea power in the Western Pacific. And of course, this is in some ways a dramatic historic turn of events, right? Japan has been in many ways a leading sea power for a leading local sea power for over a century, especially since Japan's victory over China in the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894 and 1895. And of course, through the evolution of history during the Cold War, Japan became an essential element of a broader U.S. maritime strategy in the Asia Pacific. And of course, Japan itself evolved and developed its own maritime capability and became a leading maritime power in the Western Pacific throughout the Cold War and well into the 21st century. And so this displacement of Japan is in many ways kind of a tectonic shift. And I think it's surprising that given the importance of this shift, that it has received relatively little attention. And so my argument for the report is that this power transition at sea, this historic transition, will introduce more instability in the region. It will further stress the U.S. Japan alliance, and that this shift will further intensify the Sino-Japanese naval rivalry that has been ongoing for at least a decade, if not more. And that I think at the operational level, I think what's most worrisome is that this power shift will convince Chinese statesmen and commanders to pursue an offensive strategy should deterrence fail. Now, let me say a few words about the report's methodology. I came to many of these findings based on an extensive survey of the Chinese open source literature. And so when I go through some of these points, I'm actually talking about how Chinese strategists have expressed their views about Japanese sea power. And so in the report, I basically let the Chinese speak for themselves about their view of the Sino-Japanese naval balance and about their views of new options for the PLA as it becomes ever more capable. And it should be noted that until now, these open sources have been largely unexplored. Now, I think it's very interesting to talk about this particular point is that I think when we look at the Chinese language open source literature, I think as American analysts, I think we tend to be much more self-centered, right? You know, we tend to be much more interested in what Chinese strategists are saying about the United States and about the US military. And I think there's this whole sort of segment of the literature that gets overlooked, including what I have documented as a voluminous Chinese literature on Japan, Japanese security policy, Japanese defense policy, and the self-defense force. Because Japan obviously is China's neighbor. It is also the third largest economy. It possesses a modern, very capable military. It is one of the military that China would need to contend with should deterrence fail, say over Taiwan. And so Japan looms large in the Chinese imagination, probably second only to the United States. And yet, that gets lost. That part of the debate gets lost because I think most of us are so focused on how the Chinese view Japan. So that's another part of the contribution is to bring to light the degree to which the Chinese pay attention to Japan's defenses. All right, now that I've established for you the argument, I'm now going to talk about why this topic matters. First of all, Japan is a critical stakeholder and defender of the maritime order since the end of World War II. the Japanese Maritime Service has helped to keep the peace essentially for all these decades. It is the combined naval power of the United States and its allies in Asia that constitutes the larger strategic balance. And so it's not enough simply to look at the bilateral Sino-US naval balance. It truly is a multilateral naval balance. And so therefore, Japan's relative decline at sea has implications for regional stability, deterrence, warfighting, and alliance cohesion. Secondly, in the past, when big shifts in the naval balance of power have taken place, bad things have typically followed, right? So if you think about from antiquity to the modern period, if you think about the Peloponnesian War, the First Sino-Japanese War, the Russo-Japanese War, World War I and World War II, all of those great power wars were preceded in one way or another by a shift, in some cases, a dramatic shift in the naval balance of power. And that's why it's not surprising that great powers and regional powers have historically been acutely sensitive to changes in the naval balance. And in some cases, they have taken drastic actions to forestall a further deterioration. Think about Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, right? Or think about Japan's surprise attack on the Russian fleet based in Port Arthur during the Russo-Japanese War. Now, however, I'm not arguing that Japan ought to take preventive or preemptive action. I think there's in fact another historical analogy that's worth thinking about, and that is Britain's decline relative to the Soviet Union during the Cold War. The Soviets, beginning in the 1960s, outstripped the British in sea power, as the Chinese are now outstripping the Japanese today. The concern then was that Britain would not be able to cope with Soviet probes in the North Sea, basically Soviet advances in Britain's own backyard. The danger was that if the United States were preoccupied, say, in the Eastern Med, wrangling with the Soviet Navy in that part of the world, the United States might not be able to count on the British to hold, much less push back against the Soviets. And I think this historical parallel is probably more apt when describing Japan's predicament today. And I'm happy to talk about the implications of that, certainly during the Q&A. So let me now talk about the Sino-Japanese naval balance. I think it's important to note that the scale and the speed of the shift are simply remarkable. And if you look at it in terms of naval terms, and I use various metrics to measure this, if you look at fleet size, basically the number of ships at sea, if you measure the total tonnage of the battle force between both sides, if you measure the average tonnage, because it's because that metric measures the average capacity of individual ships. And if you look at firepower, if you look across these four basic metrics, what you find is that China has not only caught up, but it has rapidly surpassed Japan. So let me just take a moment to talk about Japanese and Chinese firepower. And what I did was I used the vertical launch system, the VLS cells. They're basically silos built into ships that fire missiles of all kinds, offensive and defensive missiles. So I used the so-called VLS cells as a proxy for measuring firepower for both fleets. And what was interesting was that Japan was actually ahead of China, introducing the VLS technology by about a decade. And in fact, China had none. It had zero VLS systems until the early 2000s. Yet, China rapidly closed the gap in the mid-2000s and then surpassed Japan in the number of VLS cells in 2017. 2017 was kind of the crossover point, if you will, in terms of Chinese firepower within the fleet. In 2019, the Chinese Navy had 60% more VLS cells than Japan. And by 2020, the Chinese Navy had 75% more in VLS cells compared to the Japanese Maritime Service. And so what we're seeing here is not just that China catching up to Japan and surpassing Japan, but that China is now surpassing Japan at an accelerated rate. In other words, the gap is actually going to widen and widen even further in the coming years. Add on top of all of that, in terms of firepower, is that the Chinese Navy in general has what's called an outranging advantage, meaning that Chinese missiles have longer ranges than their Japanese counterparts. And what that means for the Japanese Navy, the Japanese Maritime Service, of course, is that it would have to come within the range of Chinese missiles, get well within the range of Chinese missiles in order to close in to a sufficient distances to strike back. So a metaphor, if you will, of this outranging challenge is, imagine two boxers. One boxer has just much longer arms than the other one, right? The one with the longer arms will be able to get the punch in much sooner and faster and earlier than the other boxer. And that's one of the advantages that China currently has over Japan when it comes to this idea of outranging. Let me now turn to the bulk of my report, the core substance of the report. And I'm going to firstly talk about sources of the naval competition. And I'm going to talk about this, again, exclusively from the Chinese perspective. In other words, based on the Chinese literature, what are they saying about what's leading to an intense naval competition with Japan? The first source is simply the dramatic power shift that has taken place in terms of comprehensive national power. It's because of China's growing economy, its rapid growth that has translated into bigger defense budgets. And it's that broader power shift in which China displaced Japan as the second largest economy of the world in the world. All of these things have in their view fueled Japan's latent insecurities. And that has made Japanese decision makers much more acutely sensitive to falling behind China in the maritime domain. And therefore, Japan is now pushing back and competing in order to prevent China from moving too far ahead in this aspect of the competition. Another source of the competition is geography. The Chinese frequently talk about the first island chain, which is the transnational archipelago that stretches from the Japanese islands through Taiwan through the Philippines. And of course, Japan occupies the northern half of the first island chain. And of course, the island chain is in many ways both a physical and a metaphorical barrier to China's maritime ambitions, right? If you're sitting in Beijing, looking out into the Western Pacific, what you see are this island barrier in which occupants of the island barrier are either formal allies or close friends of the United States. And that, I think, animates much of Chinese threat perceptions of their maritime environment. And I look back to Chinese official documents, and they declare that the first island chain represents this kind of barrier to China's seaward turn. And they express in particular Japan's commanding position over the northern half of the first island chain. In particular, they're concerned about Japan's military disposition on the Southwest Islands, which is the island chain that stretches from the south of Kyushu all the way to the northeast coast of Taiwan. Now, another source of the competition is the U.S. Japan alliance itself. Chinese analysts see the alliance as a powerful strategic bloc that has both the means and the ambitions to frustrate China's maritime ambitions. And what's really interesting is kind of reading into how the Chinese interpret the alliance. So they see the United States in a very utilitarian fashion, using the alliance to contain China. And that Japan, in the meantime, is again adopting a very utilitarian approach, is using the alliance basically to use it as a platform to extend its influence both regionally and globally. Frequently, these interpretations are in some ways at odds with reality. And so I think, we do need to, seek to understand Chinese perceptions, why the Chinese perceive reality in these ways. And that, in fact, potentially these perceptions and misperceptions may be sources of unquestioned biases that could in turn, I think, have some big impacts on Chinese decision making. And so seeking to understand those misperceptions is as important as understanding the gap between those misperceptions and what's actually happening to the alliance and to other issues. In any event, Chinese analysts also blame the source of the naval competition to Japan's position on regional and extra-regional security. They see Japan promoting, for example, a like-minded maritime coalition designed specifically to isolate China. And so, when Japan talks about, maritime democracies organized around shared values and so forth, Chinese analysts see that as an anti-China coalition, essentially. Some also see Japan as using the South China Sea disputes to tie down China there. In other words, Japan's efforts to engage in capacity building with the various frontline states in Southeast Asia, including Vietnam and the Philippines, they see that as an effort essentially to draw China's attention to the South in order to divert China's attention from the dispute that it has with Japan in the East China Sea, particularly over the Senkakus. They also see Japan's global posture as a source of the competition. As we all know, Japan now has a presence in Djibouti. It has been conducting various maritime patrols in the Indian Ocean. That means, of course, that as China is extending its influence across the Indian Ocean through the Belt and Road Initiative, through its own anti-piracy patrols in the Gulf of Aden, is that what we're seeing essentially is an overlapping presence across these maritime domains. And what's interesting is, among some Chinese analysts, at least, is that they view this overlapping presence as a source of competition because they see sea lane security in fundamentally zero-sum terms. In other words, they believe that one who has dominance over those sea lanes will give that side leverage over the other side in terms of leverage over the lifeblood that supports the economic well-being of both China and Japan. So whoever gains dominance over those sea lanes will then furnish them leverage over the other side. Now, the final source of the competition, which I think is fascinating, and one that I think is frequently overlooked, is Chinese characterizations of Japan's national character as a source of the naval competition. Some Chinese strategists argue that Japan's hostility towards China is in fact fundamentally ingrained in Japan's national DNA. They point to history, they point to antiquity, that Japan was never part of the tribute system. They point to 19th century politics in which Japan embraced the West and rejected Asia during the Meiji Restoration. That during this period, Japanese strategists imbibed Western sea power thought, especially those of Mahan, Alfred Thayer Mahan, who's of course the founder of modern sea power theory. And of course, Mahan's theory has frequently been attributed to sort of these offensively oriented mindsets. And so the fact that the Japanese became so attracted to Mahan's theory to them shows that Japanese strategists have this inherently built-in offensively oriented mindset, and that this mindset is in fact deeply embedded in Japanese culture going back centuries. So I quote in the report a Chinese senior military officer, Senior Captain Feng Liang of the Naval Command College, who argued that the Japanese possess quote unquote expansionist genes. And so in some ways, if you read into some of this literature on how the Chinese view Japanese national characters, it's almost like a clash of civilizations on steroids. Now, in my view, these Chinese perspectives are worrisome because what they present is a picture of sort of inevitability about the rivalry, because there are not only structural, a whole host of geographical as well as cultural sources of the competition that are driving both sides to compete with each other in a very intense manner. Let me now turn to the second big component of the report, which is how did the Chinese view the Sino-Japanese naval balance itself? Well, what's really interesting is, as I track the literature, is that a decade ago, the Chinese were in many ways in awe of the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force. They saw that the maritime service was enjoying expanding capabilities and was increasingly going global. They were particularly impressed with Japan's procurement and acquisition, the way in which Japan introduced new ships and warships and capabilities in a way that kept Japan at the leading technological edge. What's interesting is the literature that I surveyed for the past few years is not so much, right? They're not nearly as impressed or in awe of the Japanese maritime service. Part of the reason is that China itself is rapidly closing the gap. Chinese analysts point out that China is no longer the weakling that it was 2 decades ago. They also argue that, in fact, it's even hard to compare China today to 10 years ago. And some even argue that in 10 years, a decade hence, China will, in fact, reach strategic superiority over Japan, although that term remains undefined. But Chinese analysts also point to Japanese weaknesses. They criticize Japan for engaging in an imbalanced development of naval power, that the Japanese have been too narrowly focused on niche missions. In particular, over-specialization in anti-submarine warfare, mine countermeasures that are designed largely to complement the United States or to plug gaps in US military capabilities. And they are particularly critical of Japan's supposed slavish adherence to US priorities and Japan's dependence on the United States. And that therefore, because of this over specialization, Japan lacks the independent capability to defend itself against a great power like China. And they point to things like the Japanese maritime service lacking lift and lacking the logistical basis to engage in a protracted fight against China. The Chinese also point to vulnerabilities of Japan's Navy to China's so-called reconnaissance strike complex, which is of course a complex that fuses advanced sensors with precision strike, long-range precision strike capabilities. And the Chinese argue that the PLA and the PLA Navy particularly now can not only outrange, but also overwhelm Japanese fleet defenses. In fact, I came across one article that argued that the Japanese light carriers, the helicopter carriers that are currently being deployed, would be quote unquote superb targets for Chinese missiles. Again, the language here is very important, right? This isn't, you can tell from the writings that this is now a nation that's on the move, that's increasingly confident, perhaps even overconfident of their capabilities. There's a lot of literature about Japan's plans to convert their helicopter carriers to embark fixed wing naval aviation, to embark the F-35Bs. Now, the Chinese themselves have long expected Japan to do so, and they've been following Japan's development in this area very closely. But what's really interesting is that the literature these days suggests that they're far more sanguine about this development, even compared to 5 years ago. In fact, some are doubtful that Japan would actually get a lot of mileage out of converting those carriers to embark the F-35Bs. The Chinese literature on Japanese anti-submarine warfare is also very interesting because that has remained a Japanese specialty. It's one of the capabilities that's virtually second to none in the world. And yet the Chinese no longer see Japanese submarine hunting capabilities as threatening as it was in the past. They argue that the Cold War experience is no longer as applicable, that Japan is overstretched geographically, that Japan would have a hard time covering all of the narrow seas and choke points along the Southwest Islands and beyond, and that Chinese submarines themselves have improved substantially so that it would be much harder for the Japanese to find the Chinese boats. I also spent some time talking about how the Chinese some Chinese analysts have constructed scenarios, warfighting scenarios. And what's really interesting about those scenarios is that they invariably show that China is able to cripple the Japanese basing infrastructure across the Southwest Islands at the outset of a conflict. And as a result of Japan losing access, particularly to their air bases, Japan loses command of the air very quickly, which then becomes key to allowing the Chinese to engage in follow-on operations. Another really interesting factor in the scenarios is that the Chinese recognize that American non-intervention to come in to help Japan is critical to Chinese success. We've been hearing a lot of news about the Chinese carrier. Well, what's really interesting in these scenarios is that the carriers don't necessarily play a direct warfighting role. They're seen as having a diversionary role, meaning that the very presence of a Chinese carrier will force Japan to allocate a disproportionate amount of resources in tracking that carrier battle group. And consistent with Chinese doctrine, these scenarios envision naval engagements that are lethal, quick, and decisive, where the Japanese and the Chinese lose significant elements of their fleet within a very short period of time. Although in this case, the Japanese, of course, lose many more than the Chinese in these scenarios. So let me then conclude then by talking about what this literature and what changing Chinese attitudes about Japan mean for the U.S. Japan alliance. So clearly, if you read the literature, things like power, geography, national mood matter to the Chinese in their assessment of the broader naval balance. And I want to pause here again to reinforce the point about Chinese views of Japan's national character, which is that culture matters. I think we need to be aware that Chinese strategists frequently do not share our sensibilities. Right? I've found that they have had no problems making essentially race-based assessments of the adversary. And I think we need to take what they say about Japan's national character, however misguided, that are frequently couched in ethno-nationalist and racial terms, very seriously. Because in my view, those misperceptions, these sort of analytic filters through and lenses through which the Chinese view the world can in fact have a real world impact on how they perceive reality, how they perceive Japan, and how they perceive Japan's likely responses to a variety of Chinese initiatives. I also think that the alliance matters based on this literature review, because it's very clear through the Chinese writings that the alliance, they believe that the alliance is what truly stands in China's way of achieving Beijing's maritime ambitions. And so conversely, what this means is that we have to make absolutely sure that Chinese decision makers do not misread Allied resolve. And that leads me to some words on Allied strategy. I think, one way to think about how the alliance can maintain its competitiveness is to really evaluate China's psychological profile, if you will. And I speculate in the report that China's risk sensitivity is likely going to grow as its very capital intensive fleet grows, right? China is now building its own Navy. And so what we now know is, of course, the political leadership has put in a lot of political capital to support this buildup. What that means, of course, is China now has something that's both fiscally and politically valuable that Beijing probably doesn't want to lose in a single afternoon, right? And so in some ways, to put it very bluntly, whatever China holds dear, I think the alliance needs to think about holding it hostage, right? As a form of deterrence. The question is, could the alliance credibly promise to hold at risk the Chinese fleet? And in my view, this message will resonate because, as we know, Chinese strategists are also good students of the past, including their own. The Chinese have written extensively about the Sino-Japanese War, the Russo-Japanese War. They've studied the Falklands War. And what they find from those three cases is that defeat at sea typically sows the seeds of regime change, right? It fundamentally destabilizes the regime. And so the stakes are very high in terms of the survival of the Chinese fleet. And so I think ultimately we have to convince Beijing of the strategic and operational integrity of the alliance and the indivisibility of the alliance. And that I think we need to communicate very clearly the consequences, particularly the operational consequences of deterrence failure for the Chinese Navy. And I think there are, a variety of methods that can be done to convey this message, and happy to talk a bit more about that during the Q&A. So this concludes my presentation, and I very much look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Toshi. That was an absolutely fascinating presentation. We have, of course, many people here who are real specialists in this area. I think particularly in that, of course, Professor Scheer and Professor Deming. Professor Scheer served in senior positions with both the Pentagon, our Department of Defense, and also the State Department. And Ambassador Professor Deming also is a real specialist. Perhaps if we could start with them in terms of commentary. Dave, would you like to head off?
Thanks, Kent, and thanks, Toshi, for that fantastic presentation. It was very stimulating. I have a question relating to the likelihood of a Chinese preemptive war on Japan. In 1979, the Chinese waged war on Vietnam, ostensibly to punish the Vietnamese. But a big and important strategic outcome of the war was that it demonstrated to the world that the Vietnam Soviet ally wouldn't come to their assistance. Is it far-fetched to believe that, given increased Chinese confidence in their capabilities, in combination with the misperceptions you document, that the Chinese might be tempted to wage such a war on Japan in order to demonstrate that the United States will not come to their aid? Is that too much risk for the Chinese?
That's a great question, and I think there are probably two broad ways of thinking about this. One is thinking about this in terms of historical examples or analogies, and I think I've dabbled in the 1974 Paracel Sea Battle, in which the Chinese took the paracels from South Vietnam. And I think what was really telling about that particular case was the strategic circumstances surrounding the battle. So the battle itself is very fascinating, but I actually think that the political diplomatic situation was actually even more important, which was the timing of it, right? Why 1974? Well, it was a time in which the United States had withdrawn from South Vietnam in 1973, right? It essentially abandoned its ally. Also, of course, it coincided with China's opening to the United States and to the rest of the world in 1972. And I think that meant that the U.S. policymakers were far more eager to normalize relations with China above all else in the broader geopolitical competition against the Soviet Union. And so I think, again, this means that I think Beijing's calculus about America's commitment to its allies, I think, was a critical component in explaining why they took paracels when they did. So I think the key here is to try to discern what broader diplomatic political elements of the U.S. Japan alliance might send that kind of a message to Beijing that would convince Beijing that it now has an opportunity to reprise 1974. So I think to the extent that we can ensure that we don't misconvey the solidarity of the alliance, but also don't present China with the opportunity to drive wedges into the alliance, I think is absolutely key. There's another way of thinking about this, which is the balance between the operational efficacy of preemptively striking Japanese or even US forces on Japan versus the strategic consequences of doing so. So it's a kind of a balance, right? So operationally, a preemptive strike is very efficacious because, of course, you deliver the first blow, you knock the adversary off balance, you create all sorts of initiative on the battlefield that creates, additional operational opportunities. And so again, it's very efficacious from an operational perspective. That also happens to jive with or consistent with Chinese military doctrine when it comes to preemption or first strike. On the other hand, there are all these strategic risks, right? Which is, if you do a first strike, you're virtually guaranteeing Japan's involvement in a conflict, whether it's over Taiwan or something else. The third largest economy with a very capable military. So the possibility of adding more third-party intervention into the equation is certainly potentially strategically counterproductive, right? I mean, the analogy here is Germans' calculus during World War I, right? You invade neutral countries, which is operationally efficacious, but you're guaranteeing Britain's involvement, right, on the European continent. That, I think, is the similar kind of balancing that Chinese decisions need to consider. Now, given what I've laid out in my report, I think there are two ways to kind of interpret this, right? Which is, it really depends on whether the PLA or the Chinese leadership believes that Japan will be a third-party intervener regardless, right? In other words, whatever happens, however it happens, say over deterrence failure related to Taiwan, that Japan is going to be all in, regardless of the circumstances, because again, of the Chinese tendency to read the worst into Japanese intentions, right? So if the Chinese political and military leadership convinces themselves that Japanese intervention along with the United States is virtually inevitable, right? Then the benefits of the operational efficacy begins to rise against the strategic risks. And so again, I think that's mostly interpretive. That's mostly of a value judgment. I'm inclined to adopt that interpretation again based on my reading of the of the literature. I think, there are other plausible ways of interpreting how the Chinese might respond. So I think that, again, to kind of, reprise, what I've just said, firstly, I think it's how the Chinese evaluate the balance between the operational benefits of striking first and the likely strategic costs. And then the second is, how do the Chinese evaluate the actual health of the alliance, right? Are there pre-existing schisms that are in place where the Chinese believe that they have an opportunity to kind of drive that wedge and not worry about American intervention on behalf of Japan?
That's interesting. And in this context, the upcoming visit of Prime Minister Suga becomes even more important.
Absolutely.
Russ, did you have some things that you would like to add?
Yeah, if I may, I'd be very interested in if you could draw out a little bit more of the stereotypical images the Chinese project of Japanese and Japanese warfighting capabilities. Do these go back to World War II stereotypes, or are they more nuanced?
I think some of them, so part of it is, it's a very complicated question because, part of it is there are probably built-in incentives to write about your potential adversary in certain ways. And it is especially easy to kind of caricature Japan in order to, say, score political points, to make it easier to have your article published, or to have your article gain approval for publication. So I think there are those types of incentives that tend to sort of distort the discourse. But I would also want to reinforce the fact that I think these feelings are, we should not discount this idea that these feelings are deeply felt, that Chinese strategists do hold these kinds of views about Japan, however misguided they may be. It is, part of it is a product of decades of the humiliation narrative that's been inculcated among the Chinese public and the Chinese strategic elites that goes all the way back to the kind of the post-Tiananmen period of, the West and Japan humiliated China since the mid-19th century, and the kind of the nationalist fervor that's been developed in the intervening years. So I think on the one hand, it's possible that this is simply a, kind of a code, right, for, saying, I'm speaking sort of what's considered politically correct language to describe Japan. On the other hand, I also have a sense that Chinese strategists do genuinely feel this type of animus, if not animosity, towards Japan. And I think the real danger here is the kind of the potentially sort of the pathology of this dynamic, right? Which is, if you are now not only increasingly nationalistic, and you are increasingly inclined to view Japan as the weaker party, and if there is a crisis that drives up this nationalist sentiment, how do these forces interact, right? Would they make it much more likely for the political leadership or the military leadership to urge, for example, an operation to teach, Japan a lesson? And so I think these sort of intangible forces related to how they assess Japan's national character matters. And I think we need to pay attention to them.
No, thank you. It also makes it more difficult for them to back away from a crisis potentially as well.
Absolutely. So, right. I think, there's a real danger of painting Chinese decision makers themselves into a corner, right? If they've fed these expectations that China is going to, sort of, right the historical wrongs of the past, it's going to wash away the humiliation, and there is a crisis at hand, and it may be very, very difficult for the Chinese political leadership to kind of walk that back.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you.
The floor is open, but I did have, as people are beginning to decide what question to ask, I did have one myself. you said something, used a phrase in passing that stuck in my mind. You asked, how does China evaluate the health of the alliance? And I wondered if you could just elaborate. You've stressed again and again, messaging to China is important. We have to convince them that there is alliance solidarity and so on. You mentioned the case of the Paracels, where it seemed that, of course, in 1974, there really was daylight between the U.S. and South Vietnam, and the Chinese moved into that. So how do they evaluate the health of the alliance? And what can we do besides rhetoric? I mean, technology is changing and so on. Do you have a few more words about how we can convince them that the health of the alliance is strong?
Yeah, so I think there are many ways to evaluate the health of the alliance, but I do want to say that
I mean, the Chinese, how they would do it.
Sure. So I think rhetoric. So let me just touch on the rhetoric piece. I think rhetoric does matter. So to the extent that we say certain things, like very forthright early on, talking about how the security treaty covers the Senkakus, for example, right? That can be traced all the way back to President Obama, and then has been repeated since. That there is essentially a bipartisan consensus, and we've heard early on in the Biden administration these assurances being issued at the top levels, from the president, I think, to the SecDef, to the Secretary of State. I mean, it's pretty remarkable. Rapid fire shots of reassurance. I think that message is being received, in my view. But I also think that, yes, in addition to words, we need action to back up those words, and I think part of it is one way is and it's being advanced by the folks who are far more expert than I am, which is developing a joint and combined command, say headquartered in the Southwest Islands or elsewhere, in which combined, integrated interoperability, all of those things are reinforced. I think organizational changes to the grand bargain that makes it much more difficult to China to drive wedges between Washington and Tokyo, I think would be one element. So an organizational change in the alliance's defense posture. I also think that there are sort of physical changes to the alliance posture that could take place, whether it is to essentially make the alliance more flexible and also less brittle. So more flexible meaning, having the ability to, respond to a heavy first strike by dispersing and pulling back high value assets, but having the capacity to bring forces back in. It also means greater resilience in thinking about how to invest in our existing basing infrastructure, so that they're not only more dispersed, meaning that it makes them less vulnerable to a kind of a massive preemptive strike that would allow the Chinese to take out these big bases all in one move. Having this more dispersed infrastructure would mean that the Chinese would have to deal with a much larger target set. It also means hardening the basing infrastructure so that they're less vulnerable to some of the precision strike, long range strike capabilities of the PLA. So I think there are all of these types of measures. I also think technical collaboration on key technologies, whether it's the development, a joint development of a missile system, long-range anti-ship, cruise missile system, to kind of reprise some of the past technological cooperation, say on the Standard Missile 3, that was that's been held up as a real success. We have all sorts of sort of technical, precedents for technical collaboration. So again, going through some of those steps, I think clear statements of intent to signal the solidarity of the alliance. I think organizational changes, operational changes, posture changes, and technological changes. I think you can talk about all sorts of, you can bend these in a variety of ways. I think the combination of all of those would, I think, very clearly send a signal to Beijing. And I would say, again, based on my reading of the Chinese literature, is that they are inclined to take these initiatives very seriously, because they all agree that it's the U.S. Japan alliance, it's this strategic bloc that has the mass, the technological basis, the political will and the resources to bulk China's ambitions going forward.
Very interesting. Thank you, Toshi. We have a question here I see in the chat from Charlie, who asks, can you address the subject of Japanese intermediate range ballistic missiles aimed at Chinese and North Korean targets? A little off the maritime area, but I wonder, do you have some comments on that?
Sure. I think that part of the deterrence equation, to go back to your question, Professor Calder, about sort of what kinds of things can the alliance do to shore up deterrence, is in fact incorporating different tools, including land-based missiles as a part of the alliance architecture. And there are clearly downsides to these options, right? Because developing long-range offensive missiles and deploying them on Allied soil is not without controversy, as we all know from the Euro missile crisis of the Cold War. But I think let me set aside the political problems and just say a few words about the kind of the operational benefits. So this gets back to the tension, right, between operational benefits versus the kind of the strategic political drawbacks. So let me just focus on the operational piece of it. In my view, and that these operational benefits also have some political strategic benefits. Land-based missile forces can be very survivable. As we know from our experiences during the first Gulf War through our campaign over Kosovo, is that mobile missile systems are very hard to catch on the ground. They can do what's called shoot and scoot. They can fire their missiles and then move to a different location very, very rapidly. And so even with American air dominance in those two wars during the first Gulf War and the Kosovo campaign, is that we had a heck of a hard time tracking enemy mobile missile units. And so again, we can turn some of these problems onto China, right? A lot of these allied mobile missile systems, if you will, deployed on Japan and elsewhere, would be equally difficult to target from the Chinese perspective. If they are able to shoot and scoot, Chinese sensors will have an equally tough time to keep track of them. And so survivability is going to be one of the sort of the operational benefits of having these types of longer range missiles. There's also, we shouldn't be thinking about the missile system as a kind of a single solution to the problem. We should be thinking this as a kind of what's called a force mix, right? The missiles are going to be a part of a larger package, including naval and air forces that will be, participating in any sort of campaign. And so we should be thinking about the missile not as a substitute for air and naval forces. It should be considered a complement, meaning that the missiles, if they're assigned to a specific set of enemy targets, that would in fact help to relieve some of the material pressures on the air and naval forces. Perhaps the missiles will target certain sets of targets. That means that as a part of the larger division of labor, US air, naval forces, and allied air and naval forces then could be freed from doing other things that might be more important, right? So it's thinking about sort of where the land-based missile force fits into a larger defense strategy, rather than, I think, making sort of sweeping claims that, the missiles will solve all of our problems, that it's some kind of a panacea. So, and that means that it might free up the Air Force to do things that it's much more programmatically, well tailored to do. It might free up the Navy also to free up some of their precious, scarce resources to do, a variety of other missions that's now being sort of taken care of by these land-based forces. I think really, to me, one of the most important sort of operational / strategic benefits is that, to me, it is a very tangible token of America's commitment to defend its allies, because we are talking essentially about literal, boots on the ground. We are putting American troops in harm's way. People don't like to talk about the term, tripwire, but they will serve at that tripwire function by ensuring that any adversary attack on those forces would virtually guarantee American intervention on behalf of its ally. And again, unlike naval and air forces that can pull back and go to different places, those forces would be there to stay. So I think the political symbolism of America's commitment to the defense of its allies would be strongly aided and complemented by having this extra sort of arrow in the quiver, right? It's an extra tool in the toolkit, that would help to reinforce Allied reassurance.
So should we see, for example, the Aegis Ashore issue in that context?
Well, the thing with the Aegis Ashore, again, at the operational level, is that, unlike the mobile land-based system, they're fixed sites and they could be very vulnerable to, Chinese long-range fires that can, overwhelm defenses. So, but yes, I think the logic of having ground-based systems is that, in my view, it conveys a qualitatively different kind of commitment to the defense of your allies.
Okay, thank you. I see that we have an interesting question from General Tom Drowan, who was with the Air Force Academy for some time. He asks, nuclear deterrence and war fighting is often factored out of the discussion, perhaps even given the advent of AI, hypersonic missiles, and 5G. Could you address the credibility of U.S. extended nuclear deterrence in U.S. Japan security relations?
That is a really, really great, but also a very difficult question. I think extended nuclear deterrence is always a very tricky strategic question. Some people have argued that it is just fundamentally incredible to have extended deterrence. Questions about whether you are prepared to trade your allies' capital for your own and so forth. And we know that that there has been in the past when we were in a crisis with China, that that a similar quip, I guess, was offered from the Chinese side to his American counterpart. Would the United States be willing to trade Los Angeles for Taipei? Now, that's not to say that that's what they're talking about. What they're simply talking about is the relative stakes involved for both sides, right? The calculus is that China has a greater stake in Taiwan, and therefore would be prepared to put more political military capital in achieving its aims over Taiwan versus the United States. So what that quip was designed to do was to highlight the asymmetry of interest between the two sides, not about actual exchanges of nuclear weapons. But I do take the point that extended deterrence is a very difficult question, and that it is in many ways fundamental to the health of the U.S. Japan alliance, right? It's what underwrites the credibility of U.S. commitment to Japan, and I think this is going to be, in my view, this extended deterrence question is going to become even more complicated as China's nuclear modernization proceeds apace. Now, we don't have to get into whether China really can, double or triple its nuclear arsenal, which was a kind of a source of debate recently. We can kind of set aside the numbers question, but the fact remains is that China is in fact modernizing and growing its nuclear arsenal. And I think what is really interesting, it's not just that its strategic arsenal is growing, which means that it gives China greater assurance that it has a retaliatory capability to strike back in the event of an American first strike, right? It will have a larger residual force. It'll have greater confidence in their second strike retaliatory capability. It's not only that, right? That you know, China is gaining a much more credible, assured retaliatory capability. It's also that China has a growing range of theater range capabilities that allows China to target theater targets, say, Japan. I think what this kind of introduces is, I think we're kind of in some ways going back in time to the Soviet development of theater range missiles that were able to essentially target Europe while having the strategic forces deter the United States. So and what that dynamic created was the so-called delinking or the decoupling problem, right? Is that could Moscow basically threaten Europe with its theater range missiles while holding the United States back? And I guess the future question in terms of China's nuclear modernization is, could China now do the same to the United States in the Western Pacific? Could it, because of its prioritization of theater nuclear missile development, be able to pose those kinds of similar questions towards the United States? And in that context, extended deterrence is going to be even more difficult, in my view, in the coming years.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We have a question here from Kunio Uehara. Two questions that flow from your discussion. The first of them, he would like to know China's action and views toward Russia, how the Chinese Navy trains themselves. Do Russians, in other words, relations in military relations between Russia and China, how do the Chinese Navy train themselves? Do Russians take place in their training? And then secondly, how do Chinese naval analysts or strategists describe Russia and the Russian Navy? In economic terms, of course, Russia is certainly becoming a junior partner, but how do they regard Russia? So some interesting questions there relating to Chinese views of the Russians.
Sure. I've recently written another report that just came out a few months ago, looking at sort of China's geostrategic predicament. And I think what is really interesting in the Chinese literature is that Chinese strategists write about themselves in terms of the geostrategic posture as that of a hybrid land sea power. And when the Chinese talk about a hybrid land sea power, they're referring to countries that have to make continental commitments because they share land borders with other great powers, but they also have to confront great maritime powers in offshore areas. And in the Chinese literature, what's really interesting is they're fairly realistic and somewhat pessimistic, because if you look at history, hybrid land sea powers have a really tough time becoming a successful sea power. The historical record is frankly awful for hybrid land sea powers. In fact, there's a great study that came out from the Naval War College about a decade ago that basically said that you'd have to go back to antiquity, basically, to find a hybrid land sea power that successfully developed sea power. And so China faces a very similar predicament because China borders, and I'm using this way to get back to Russia, which is China borders two great continental powers, Russia and India. And and it faces the United States and its maritime allies along its maritime seaboard. And what that means, of course, is that as a hybrid land sea power, it faces security commitments in the landward direction and the seaward direction, and that it could never really devote the entirety of its resources to the maritime domain, even with friendly relations with Russia for the past few decades. And as I've described it in this other report, is that the Chinese see the past 2 decades as a kind of a peace dividend, right? Meaning, relatively friendly relations and cooperative and increasingly militarily, close relations with with Russia essentially meant that it has neutralized one part of its frontier in the continental direction, affording China the strategic space to go in the maritime direction. In other words, it is the relative peace on the continental borders that has been the precondition for China to invest an ever larger amount of its national resources into maritime power and aerospace power in the direction of the Western Pacific. So Russia looms very large in, I think, China's strategic calculus. And I think what's really interesting is, now that we have the Himalayan border crisis between China and India somewhat behind us, it would be interesting to kind of understand what drove Chinese calculations in the context, right? Which is, again, China has to balance resources in the continental and maritime directions. So will a prolonged, protracted, simmering crisis or confrontation with India come at the expense of its maritime project, right? Because these are all about trade-offs. And so in that context, Russia has, essentially bought China quite a bit of strategic space to invest in the maritime domain. And so it would be in China's long-term interest to sustain that. The question is, and I think there is debate as to whether this relationship, this friendly and ever closer relationship, will be a permanent factor or a temporary factor. And again, it depends on who you ask. You have people who say, if you look at history, if you simply look at geography, China and Russia are natural enemies, and there's no way that they could surpass that. Others are now claiming that China and Russia now on the verge of forming something that's akin to a semi-alliance, a strategic bloc that could pose all sorts of problems. So again, depending on where you stand on that spectrum, you're either going to be bullish or optimistic about China's prospects in the maritime domain. Now, as for the issue of Chinese operational efficacy at sea, I mean, yes, it's true that Russia provided kind of the initial impetus by selling hardware to the Chinese in the 1990s. What we're now seeing, at least from a technical industrial perspective, is China has now achieved self-sufficient indigenous productive capacities. Now, there are still, sort of technical bottlenecks in certain technologies, but we've seen China emerge as a world-beating naval building power. It is a world-beating shipbuilding power now, and it is producing it has engaged in serial production of a whole range of surface combatants, from cruisers, destroyers, frigates, and corvettes, making the Chinese Navy now the largest Navy in the world. Most of them by now are modern by Western standards, are multi-purpose, and are equipped with modern sensors and weaponry. I mean, we are looking at a respectable and an increasingly formidable naval power that's based on China's largely from China's own defense industrial base. So from a technical material perspective, I think China is well on its way. From an operational perspective, so besides hardware, there are all these software issues, right? So things like seamanship, tactical proficiency, and so forth are equally important, because it's the software that maximizes the potential of the hardware. And here too, what we're seeing is the Chinese Navy figuring things out. So if you had asked, and this is one of the things I like to say, if you had asked a PLA watcher, say in 2007, that in less than 2 years, the Chinese would deploy their first naval flotilla to the Indian Ocean, and then would continue essentially on an uninterrupted basis, rotating naval flotillas one after the other in the Indian Ocean for over a decade, and thereby making China essentially a permanent player in the Indian Ocean. If you had asked a PLA analyst back in 2007, they would say that was crazy, right? But they have figured it out. Now the learning curve has been very steep, but they have learned by doing. They have learned by engaging in expeditionary operations in distant theaters. They have learned to gradually master the art of having a genuine seagoing force. We've also seen them regularly conduct naval passages through the Miyako Strait, through the Southwest Islands, into the broader waters of the Western Pacific on an increasingly regular basis. And from what I hear from various interlocutors, their tactical proficiency in conducting these far seas operations, if you will, have increased substantially. We're now seeing the Chinese Navy, right? They've now gone to the Baltic. They've sailed through the Aleutians. They're everywhere. I mean, in many ways, this is an emerging global expeditionary force with all of the skills necessary to go with that globalizing force. So, and again, they've now had more than a decade of experience under their belt to further refine and hone. So I think both in terms of hardware and software, the Chinese Navy is on its way, and the Chinese Navy and the PLA in general have, over the past 2 decades, consistently beat out on our expectations. They have more often than not exceeded our estimates and our expectations of how far they will go, how good they will be, and so forth. So I would argue against betting against the Chinese Navy and the Chinese military in general when it comes to both skill sets and capabilities.
Just one other question that I can think of, and certainly if there are any final questions, please either put them in the chat or put up your hand. But a related question, you mentioned earlier about hybrid land-sea powers and the difficulties that they have. And then you went on in response to the question, talk especially about Russia, the kind of problems and opportunities that creates for China. And I wondered, the second country, of course, was India. And I wondered if you could say a word about the challenges that the land border with India creates in terms of diversion and so on for the Chinese. One should think that since it's right in the top of the Himalayas, and if anything, the Chinese have been the ones that are provocative, they don't consider that much of a threat that forces them to divert resources. How do they view the competition and the challenge of India?
Yeah, I've actually followed also some of the Chinese literature on the Sino-Indian sort of, emerging naval rivalry. And, what I like to say is there's almost a kind of a hierarchy of condescension historically. So the United States has typically underestimated and condescended the Chinese, and the Chinese in turn have historically looked down on and condescended on the Indians. And again, both China and India, I think, are much stronger and much more capable than the other thinks. So I think it's true that we can engage in debates about whether in terms of the tactical balance of power, whether the Himalayan border favors China or India. But I think my broader view is that, whatever that a coalition of states can do to force more difficult trade-off decisions, some of them may be minor, some of them may be major, but cumulatively speaking, they will add up over time. And so thinking of this in terms of compounding or cumulative costs, I think is probably a better way of thinking about a long-term competition. So even if the diversion of landward resources is relatively minor in terms of the broader base of Chinese resources, it's still something. But if that something adds up with other costs, I think that will compound and accumulate. So to the extent that India can divert some of those resources in the landward choices means that there are some trade-offs that are going to be made, or the cost of some of the Chinese decisions will be higher, right? Whether it's a little bit higher or a lot higher, one can debate that. But the more that we can kind of force Chinese decision makers to make more of these difficult trade-off decisions, the better, because it's one way of, metaphorically kind of throw sands in the gear of Chinese decision making, because I think for a long time they've not had to make difficult choices, right? And so the more that we can do to impose those kinds of costs in different geographical areas, in different functional areas, I think all of that will be to the good in sort of advancing U.S. and allied interest over the long term. So India, for example, also has some maritime leverage points. So I wrote a piece about a decade ago about how the Chinese perceive the Andaman Nicobar Island. And it's another island chain, if you will. And what's this, what's really interesting is that if you get to interpret and understand Chinese threat perceptions, is that some of these viewpoints can be sort of kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, meaning that Chinese strategists sort of become inclined to view certain geographical features by borrowing sort of other geographical analogies. And so they've now basically superimposed their fears of the first island chain onto the Andaman Nicobar Islands. And to the extent that that's part of the psychological profile, well, the United States and its allies and friends ought to take advantage of it. And so and it seems to me that they are inclined to view India's joint base on the Andaman Nicobar Islands as a potential leverage point. It's another iron chain with which to kind of block China's maritime ambitions west of the Malacca Strait. So to the extent that India can posture itself on the Andaman Nicobar Islands in ways that suggest that that is in fact the case, China now will have another thing that it has to worry about.
Surely.
So I think India has, I think, a variety of geostrategic choices that it can make to impose cost on China.
Okay, thank you. You've stirred up a lot of interest. Just two final questions. Maybe let me just read them together. And then, Toshi, if you could have some final remarks. The first is from Toshi Nakanishi. I believe actually he may be chiming in from Tokyo. It's a question about the Quad related to what you said. Do you think that the Quad can help deter China's military expansion? The Quad has global scale. India and Japan are quite far apart, but they can work together militarily to put pressure on China along with the United States from different directions. It maybe use the pressure points like the Andamans that you just talked about, but that was number one. And the second one from our Reischauer fellow, Rio Tanaka, and that is, how do you see the recent news that Indonesia and Japan signed an agreement of Japan's military equipment and technology in export to Indonesia? Indonesia has led the discussion on ongoing events in Myanmar among ASEAN countries, and and how do you see the Indonesia-Japan relationship today?
Sure.
So those two.
Great. Those are kind of all interrelated, so I'll try to answer them all at once. I think the Quad simply reinforces this idea that China faces a fundamental asymmetry in the competition, which is that you've heard this probably millions of times about how China doesn't have great allies and so forth. But I think the Quad is a really good manifestation of how you can operationalize some of these sort of coalition of the willing, right? Informal and formal networks of relationships that can be employed to counterbalance China. I think the Quad is, I think the recent joint statement by the Quad shows that this isn't merely a military-centric grouping, that the Quad can employ different elements of national power, including sort of COVID diplomacy, or COVID, a vaccine as an element of an instrument to compete with China. What I thought was very interesting with the joint statement, it never used the word China in the joint statement, and yet China, in my view, was everywhere in that document. It was very clear that the Quad has in some ways taken up that element of the competition. So I think the Quad needs to be broadened in terms of potential functional contributions. As I also said, naval balances in the region are fundamentally multilateral. And if you add up those four navies, it really does change the equation. But it's not just kind of the material equation. It also changes the kind of the geographical scale of things, meaning you know, you can imagine in a Quad a natural division of labor in which India and Australia may be more heavily weighted for dealing with China's challenge in the Indian Ocean. After all, Australia is an Indian Ocean power, and maybe Japan and the United States may be carrying a heavier geographical burden along the first island chain within the Western Pacific. So I think, you know, there are many ways of thinking about sort of the positive contributions that the Quad can make. Now, as for Japan to Indonesia, I mean, it simply highlights the fact that, you know, many of the U.S. allies and partners can be a net contributor to the security of the region by enabling other frontline states. You know, these things do not have to be U.S.-led. Our allies and friends should be able to help each other through these informal networks and relationships. And you know, and I think as we know, Indonesia considers itself, you know, a pretty serious power. It's in some ways a great power in its own right, and it has had, you know, it has demonstrated a willingness to stand up to China, whether it's about its, you know, illegal fishing in areas that, you know, Indonesia considers to be illegal fishing activities. Indonesia has taken some pretty strong responses, and so again, it just goes to show that, you know, this is not a bilateral competition. This truly is a multilateral competition of both formal and informal relations.
Well, you've given us an awfully lot to think about. We're honored that Asai Salam would be back and that you've done all the things that you've done. And we look forward to the next opportunity. Toshi, this has really been, you know, extremely exciting, I think, for all of us. So thank you sincerely. And we'll look forward to continuing our discussion.
Thanks, Chief.
Thank you very much for the kind words. It's a real pleasure to be back at SAIS, and I look forward to future interactions with all of you. Thank you very much.
Thanks again.